coming into EDU 206, I didn't really have a lot of experience with diversity. I've been around a few people who have disabilities, but I've never been exposed to it and learned about it in the way that I did in EDU 206. And the main thing that I'm taking away from this course is that disability does not mean inability. Simply because someone may have a disability, that doesn't mean that they are incapable of learning. There's always a way that educators can figure out a way to help them learn, and that's my job as a future educator, because I most likely will have people in my class who have disabilities, so it's important for me to realize what their strengths are and capitalize on those so I can help them learn. My diversity paper, and just thinking back to the experiences that I've had with diversity, I'm really blessed to have been exposed to the things that I have been. For example, the summer after my sophomore year in high school, I went to Costa Rica with my church, and we stayed in a slum. It was really dangerous. It was impoverished. It was really dangerous, and I wasn't aware of it at the time, but Costa Rica is one of the top locations for human trafficking and prostitution. And I've never been exposed to or seen anything like it in my life. When we left the airport and we were driving to the church where we were staying, there were women everywhere, and I didn't know what was going on, so I asked the pastor who had been before, and he said that their prostitution is rampant. And even more disturbing is that child prostitution is also rampant, and that broke my heart because I've been sheltered pretty much my entire life, and I've just never been exposed to that kind of evil, and it really broke my heart to see that. We also did a vacation Bible school for the community, and we were playing with some other kids, and we heard someone scream, and there was a lot of people running, and we walked over to where the commotion was, and a little boy had been hit by a car. And apparently in Costa Rica, the drug problem is so bad, parents will send their kids out into the street to sue whoever hit them for drug money. And so as soon as the little boy was hit by the car, someone came running over a few minutes later, and it was a man, and he had a long trench coat on, and nobody knew what was going on, and he was screaming stuff in Spanish, and we only had one person that was a translator with us, and he wasn't there at the time. And he pulled a gun out from under his coat because he thought the Americans had hit his son with the car. And so my friend and I just took off running back to the church, and it was really emotional and scary, and I've never been around a situation that dangerous in my life. And after that night, when we were talking about what had happened, I just was overwhelmed with thankfulness for what God has blessed me with. And without diversity, sometimes we can't see that. Sometimes we don't understand how much we are blessed. And I'm so thankful for that experience, because without it, I would not be nearly as thankful as I am now. And I also worked at a summer camp the summer after my senior year, and I was a camp counselor for 4 to 5-year-old boys. So I had 10 mostly 5-year-olds in my group, in my care for 8 hours a day. And that was just the gender diversity in that situation was really interesting. I have no brothers and no male cousins, so I haven't really been around boys a ton besides school, so that was interesting. And besides the gender diversity, there was a little boy in my group, and he had autism. And I wasn't aware of this the first week of camp, but I knew something wasn't right with him. And he would just, I made him hold hands, and if we were walking outside, he would just sprint off in one direction, and one of us would have to go running after him. He would get really upset. When we changed activities, he seemed kind of thrown off. He didn't know how to handle it. And when I would try to get his attention and tell him to do something, he wouldn't look at me. And I knew if he wasn't looking at me, he wasn't hearing what I was saying. So sometimes I would literally have to grab his head and get him to look at me so he could understand what I was saying. And so that was really challenging. I was really frustrated. I didn't understand how to handle the situation. When he got upset, no one could control him. So I was just really discouraged. And so I talked to his parents one day after camp, and they told me that he had autism. And they really wanted him to try to go to day camp because they wanted him to experience the normal things that little boys experience. So eventually his parents decided to take him out of the camp. It was a few weeks later. And to my surprise, I was really upset when he left because I formed a bond with him over those few weeks, and struggling to get him to listen and pay attention, and handling him when he was upset really in some way made me attached to him. And so I started to see who he was and not just his disability the longer I knew him and the longer I was around him, and that touched me. And I'd never experienced that before. I'd never bonded with anyone because at first I just thought he was too difficult to be in our group, and it would just not work. But after being around him for so long, I formed a bond with him, and that that was encouraging to me because I knew I wanted to teach at that time. So I knew that if I had a student who was particularly difficult or had a disability, I knew that just because they had a disability didn't mean that I couldn't form a bond with them or help them do certain things or help them learn. I've also been exposed to diversity through helping my grandparents with food bank. And in high school, every Saturday of the month, I would wake up really early and go help them bag groceries and do paperwork for people who came and got food at the food bank. And most of the people who came were extremely poor, and they just had really hard lives. Some of them were drug addicts. It was just really emotional. And oftentimes I would help people carry groceries to their car, and that was an opportunity for me to get to know them more and show them that I wasn't judging them based on that they had to come to the food bank. I really got to hear some great stories through that experience, and the Lord just showed me how much I have to be thankful for. And so often I take it for granted that there's a guaranteed meal when I go home for dinner, and those people don't have that. And realizing that outside of your world there are people who struggle is extremely humbling. And the Lord taught me so much about himself and about my condition outside of Christ, because outside of Christ I'm poor. I have nothing. I have to rely on him, and just like those people have to rely on the food bank. And so that was eye-opening. It strengthened my faith. Some of the things that I didn't write about in my paper were religious and sexual orientation diversity. And that's mainly because I've never really been around anyone who wasn't, or he didn't profess to be a Christian. I've been around several people who weren't religious, but I've never been around, for example, someone who was a Muslim or Catholic or an atheist. I was raised in a Christian home. I was brought up in church. The school I went to was Christian, so for the most part, everyone around me was a Christian. And I know that I want to teach in the public schools, so I really hope that before I graduate, I do have experience with religious diversity, because I feel like my perspective on it right now is very narrow, and I don't want to be narrow-minded. I want to be open-minded, and I want to hear what other people believe, and because Jesus was around people who were really religiously diverse and who didn't believe the same thing he did, and I want to understand how to better handle it, and I won't know until I'm around people who are not Christians and not professing Christians. And as far as being around people who are homosexual or bisexual, things like that. I've never had experience with that. Like I said, I was raised in a Christian home, in a Christian school, and I just never was around people who were gay or lesbian. And again, like I said, I know I'm going to be teaching in public school, and I know that there will be, some of my students will be maybe gay or bisexual. So I want to know how to best handle that, and I hope again that before I graduate, I'll have more experience with people who are diverse in their sexual orientation, so I can better teach them. And I don't want to be intimidated by that. I want to be open to them and treat them the same way that I would treat any of my other students. For my field placement, I was placed at Robert Anderson Middle School in a 7th grade math inclusion classroom, which basically means that apart from the general education students, there were students in the classroom who had disabilities or were at risk. And to be honest, I did not learn much about diversity in this environment. I didn't really see how the instruction was any different than a regular class. I was able to, however, work with a student with a learning disability, and that was informative. But I didn't feel like I gained any more diverse experiences. I felt like, honestly, it was pretty boring. The teachers didn't really do anything differently than they would in a general education classroom. One thing that I did see and that I did learn is that the student I worked with who had a learning disability had a great personality. And for some reason in my mind, I just always had this idea formed that if a student had a disability, they were automatically antisocial or mean or obnoxious, things like that. And this kid was really likable. He had a lot of friends. Some kids picked on him, but he was, for the most part, well-liked. And I just saw that even though he had a disability, that didn't affect his personality, and that was a misconception that I had. And so I'm glad that I saw that, because going into the public school classroom again, I know that I'll have students with learning disabilities, and I know that now I won't have that stigma. They won't have that stigma attached to them that they have a terrible personality simply because they have a disability. So in some ways that experience helped me gain a broader understanding of diversity, but in other ways it really didn't. As far as classwork and assignments and projects go, I learned a lot about disabilities in this course that I did not know before. I learned a lot from the group project on emotional behavioral disorders. I didn't realize that there were so many different types, and I feel that I'm prepared to teach students with emotional behavioral disorders now. I feel like I have a thorough understanding of what they are, some of the examples that would happen in the classroom. Doing the case studies every week for the different types of disabilities helped me understand what the disabilities were and what some of the effects may be. And I also enjoyed doing the small assignments online where you would read something about a learning disability, or you would do an activity that shows you what happens in a person with a learning disability's mind, especially the math activity. I had no idea that that's how learning disabilities, how they affected your brain. As a future teacher, I feel called to work with students who struggle, and taking this course was extremely helpful because it's guaranteed that I'm going to have students in my class who have disabilities, emotional, behavioral, intellectual, any type. So learning about strategies to use with these students was really helpful. The main thing that I got from this course that I could apply to how I would teach is that no matter who is in my classroom, my teaching should always be responsive to their situation. And my teaching should always reflect an understanding of where they come from. And I should always call on their different backgrounds to help them learn, whether they be linguistically diverse, physically disabled, intellectually disabled. or have an emotional behavioral disorder, any type of disorder. Since I'll be teaching in a math class, it's really hard to find strategies to use with students with disabilities. One of the things that I have found that can pretty much be applied to any type of teacher is that, as I've mentioned before, that your teaching should be responsive to their culture, disability, language, whatever it may be. How you teach should be molded to how they learn. And I think it's really important for me, not only as a teacher, but as someone investing in my students' lives, to understand where they come from and how they feel about life, learning, school. And so I feel like if I do that, and if I get to know them, get to know their parents, understand where they've come from, understand their situation, that creates an environment where learning can happen. And so, as I prepare to enter the profession, I want to make it a habit to get to know my students, because I feel like out of everything I've learned, out of every strategy, that is the most important. Specific strategies that I want to use as a teacher, I really want to use group work and peer tutoring and cooperative learning in my classroom. I feel like when you're working with students who are behind, have trouble paying attention, or may have a disability, that group work is beneficial. I think when you put students of different academic capabilities in different groups, you expose them to different types of diversity, and they have to learn how to respond to that. And I think that one of the main things that a teacher needs to do is teach students how to be a social learner and respond to different stimuli and social situations. So no matter what they're learning, English, math, history, whatever it may be, in that class they should learn how to be socially knowledgeable of different situations, because that is an important part of life, is learning how to respond in social situations. So not only do I feel accountable to teach them the content, I feel accountable to teach them how to be socially responsive. So group work is a good way to do that. I want them to know how to interact with each other, how to communicate their thoughts, how to communicate, how to teach one another. That's really important to me. And I also want them to be aware of what the expectations from me are. And if there is never a time when I explicitly say, this is what I'm requiring of you, I don't feel like they'll be successful. And so I'm going to make it a habit to constantly inform them of what I'm expecting from them. I feel like that is a key to success. So first of all, I want them to be able to work in groups and to communicate efficiently. And second of all, I want them to be knowledgeable of what is expected of them. As I said at the beginning, the main thing that I learned in this class and that has really impacted me and the way I feel about teaching is that disability does not mean inability. Simply because a student has a disability does not mean they're incapable of learning. And it's my responsibility to make sure they have the tools to learn and they understand how to learn. So my hope is that as a teacher, I'll have a thorough understanding of the students in my class's backgrounds, and that I'll be equipped to teach them in spite of their disabilities. Because if I can do that, then my classroom will be an environment where learning it just happens. It's not forced, it just happens. And that is my goal.